a young clerk named Samuel Wragg stands on the deck of a ship that is no longer going anywhere and watches a man built like a shipwright's worst nightmare pace the planks in front of him, a brace of pistols slung across his chest and a length of slow-burning cord smoking under the brim of his hat, the smoke curling past a black beard tied into a dozen small plates. Behind them, 5 more captured vessels sit at anchor across the mouth of Charleston harbour, going nowhere, their crews locked below decks. It is May of 1718, and for nearly a week the richest port in the American colonies has been sealed shut by 6 ships flying a flag nobody in the harbour wants to see twice. This episode follows the man who did that, from an unemployed sailor with no fixed name in any surviving record to the pirate, whose face still sells more merchandise than any admiral who ever hunted him. It follows the 6 years of peace and poverty that made his career possible, the single morning at a shallow North Carolina inlet in November of 1718, when that career ended, and the years after, when the wider hunt his death set loose closed the age that made him. It is a story about how easily a coastline built on trade can be held hostage by a few dozen desperate men, and about how quickly the men who could not stop that from happening learned, at last, how to end it. The pilot boat coming out of Charleston harbour on the morning of May 22, 1718, never had a chance to turn back. It ran straight into a squadron that had not been there the evening before, a heavy ship carrying somewhere near 40 guns, and 3 or 4 smaller sloops fanned out across the channel like a hand closing. Within hours, that first boat and its passengers, including a local council member named Samuel Wragg, his young son, and several other prominent residents, were prisoners aboard the flagship. Over the following days, 8 or 9 more vessels tried to leave or enter the harbour and were taken the same way. Their crews marched below decks, their cargo picked over on the flagship's open deck in full view of anyone watching from shore. Charleston in 1718 was the wealthiest port south of Philadelphia, built on rice, deerskins, and the trade in enslaved people brought through its harbour in growing numbers. Ships arriving from London carried manufactured goods and left loaded with barrels of rice destined for European tables, and the harbour's own pilots, men who knew every shoal in the channel, were themselves among the first taken hostage, which meant no vessel could safely enter or leave without the blockading squadron's leave. It had no navy of its own and no fort strong enough to challenge a squadron already sitting inside the bar, and the colony's militia, built to fight inland raids rather than a fleet action, had no way to reach ships riding at anchor in open water. For nearly a week nothing moved in or out. Ships already loaded for London sat idle, their captains watching the tide turn uselessly beneath them. Merchants who had spent a year's profit filling a hold now watched it ride at anchor under a stranger's guns, unable even to send word overland fast enough to matter. The man giving the orders wore his beard long and black, tied into small plaits with ribbon, and kept a length of slow-burning cannon match, the kind gunners used to fire their pieces, tucked under the brim of his hat before he boarded a captured vessel, so that smoke curled up past his face the whole time he stood on someone else's deck, deciding what to take. His demand, when it finally came ashore with the freed pilot boat's crew, was strange for a man holding a city's trade hostage. He did not ask for a fortune in gold, though he could likely have gotten one from the combined cargo of 9 captured ships. He asked for a chest of medicine, valued by the pirates themselves at somewhere around £300 or £400 sterling, a very large sum for medical supplies alone, and almost certainly weighted toward mercury compounds, the standard treatment of the day for syphilis, a disease that spread through crowded ships' companies as readily as any fever, and for which the treatment itself, a slow mercury course that made a man's own teeth loosen and his gums bleed, was nearly as feared as the illness. Whether the chest was meant for his own men, some of whom historians believe were suffering from the disease after months at sea with little access to a physician, or simply because he understood, medicine was worth more to a besieged town than coin it could not spend while trapped in harbour, the sources do not say for certain. The town council debated through at least one full day while the hostages waited under guard, watched the pirates drink their way through captured wine, and by some accounts came close to being killed outright when the promised chest was slow to arrive. One account has Wragg's fellow prisoners sent ashore under threat that their heads would follow if the medicine did not appear by a set hour, a threat that forced the council to move faster than its own deliberations had been going. It came. A small boat carried the chest out to the flagship, the council having decided a city's trade mattered more than the principle of refusing to bargain with a man holding their neighbours at gunpoint, a calculation any port city dependent on continuous shipping could hardly avoid making. The hostages were released, most of them stripped of fine clothes and a portion of their cash but otherwise unharmed, and put ashore in small boats to walk back into a city that had just watched itself be robbed in plain daylight for a week and could do nothing about it. The squadron weighed anchor and sailed north within days, its holds heavier with plunder taken from the merchant ships than with the medicine chest it had actually demanded, which suggests the ransom was as much a demonstration of power as a genuine need. A besieged colonial capital had bent to the will of 6 ships and roughly 300 to 400 armed men without a single shot fired at the town itself. Word of it spread down the coast and across the Atlantic within weeks, carried in the same newspapers that were only beginning to learn his name well enough to spell it consistently. Edward Thatch, called Blackbeard, and for 1 week in the spring of 1718, the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard of British America. To understand how an ordinary sailor came to hold a colonial capital hostage without firing on it, the story has to go back 5 years, to the moment a European war ended an ocean away and put thousands of men exactly like him out of work all at once. In 1713, after 12 years of fighting over who would inherit the Spanish throne, Britain, France and Spain signed the treaties that ended the War of Spanish Succession. For most of that war, Britain had licensed private ship owners as privateers, giving them legal permission, called a letter of marque, to attack and plunder enemy shipping and keep a share of what they took. It was a cheap way to fight a naval war. The Crown supplied the license, the privateer supplied the ship, the crew and the risk, and a successful cruise could make an investor and his crew rich on a single captured cargo of sugar or manufactured goods. Thousands of British and colonial sailors spent the war years learning to fight, board and sail aggressively under that arrangement, and thousands more served in the Royal Navy itself, which swelled to fight the war and then, the moment peace was signed, began paying men off by the shipload. Peace was good for merchants and terrible for sailors. The Royal Navy shrank from roughly 49,000 men under arms to under a tenth of that within a couple of years, a demobilization on a scale no colonial economy on either side of the Atlantic was prepared to absorb. Privateering commissions, worthless the moment there was no enemy left to raid, expired all at once, turning ships that had operated legally for a decade into vessels with no lawful business left to conduct. Merchant shipping, which might have absorbed some of these men, was itself glutted with sailors competing for fewer berths, at wages that fell as fast as the labour pool grew. A man who had earned a share of prize money 1 year might, the next, be offered half his old wage for twice the discipline aboard a merchant vessel whose captain could flog him for a slow answer. A trained topman who had spent the war years boarding French and Spanish prizes, for a share of the plunder now faced a choice between the low, often brutal discipline of a merchant berth, unemployment in a crowded port city where taverns filled faster than jobs did, or turning the only skill he had, taking ships by force, toward targets nobody had licensed him to attack. Historians of the period generally treat this demobilization, not any single pirate's ambition, as the true origin of what would come to be called the Golden Age of Piracy, and the timing bears this out. The number of active pirate crews in American and Caribbean waters roughly tripled within 4 years of the peace. About the man who would become Blackbeard, the documentary record from before 1716 is almost silent, and what little exists is contested. He is usually identified as Edward Thatch, sometimes spelled Teach, Thack or Taché in surviving records, and most historians now favour a birthplace in or near Bristol, England, a major port city with deep ties to the slave trade and colonial shipping, sometime in the 1680s. Some earlier popular accounts placed him in Jamaica, or claimed he served as a privateer during the war out of that island. The evidence for this is thin and contested, and it is safer to say only that a man of that description was, by the mid-1710s, an experienced sailor with the skills the war had spread throughout the Atlantic, and no legal way left to use them. A city like Bristol, its docks lined with ships fitted for the slave trade, and its taverns full of men who had spent the war years at sea, was exactly the kind of place that produced sailors with nowhere respectable left to go, once the fighting stopped. By around 1716 or early 1717, Thatch appears in the record as a crew member, and quickly a trusted one, aboard a sloop commanded by Benjamin Hornigold, one of the more established pirate captains operating out of the Bahamas. Hornigold was, by the standards of the trade, a relatively restrained commander. He reportedly refused for a time to attack British vessels at all, preferring French and Spanish prizes, a scruple that some of his crew found frustrating enough to eventually split off under other captains who cared less about the flag flying over a target. Thatch, whatever his background, distinguished himself quickly enough that within roughly a year, Hornigold gave him command of a captured sloop of his own, a mark of real trust in a trade where a captain's authority depended entirely on the confidence of the men who had elected him, and where a poor choice of subordinate could cost a captain his own ship in a mutiny. The two sailed together through 1717, raiding merchant shipping across the Caribbean and up the American coast, based out of a small island in the Bahamas that had, in the space of a few years, become something closer to an independent pirate republic than any officially administered colony. It was there, at New Providence, that the loose confederation of ships and captains who would define this era of piracy had gathered, and it is there the story needs to pause before it can explain how an unemployed sailor from Bristol became the terror of an entire coastline. New Providence in the Bahamas was never meant to be a pirate capital. Britain had claimed it decades earlier, and a small colonial government once sat at Nassau, its main settlement, but repeated French and Spanish raids during the long years of war had left the fort in ruins and the official governor gone. Its cannons spiked and its garrisons scattered to other islands or dead of fever. By around 1713, the island sat effectively without functioning colonial authority. A deep, well-sheltered harbour, easy access to the main Atlantic shipping lanes running between Europe, the Caribbean, and the American colonies, and nobody in charge to collect a duty, enforce a law, or challenge a ship flying no flag at all. Sailors turned pirate after the peace found it ready-made for their purposes, and by the middle of the decade, a rough township of tents, huts, and captured ships had grown along its shore, home at its peak to something historians estimate at 1,000 to 2,000 men, along with the merchants, tavern keepers, and prostitutes who supplied and profited from them, turning a ruined colonial outpost into one of the busiest, if least lawful, ports in the Atlantic world. What made New Providence more than a lawless anchorage was the rough set of customs that grew up around it, later called, somewhat grandly, the Pirate Code. It was never written into a single document that survives, and it varied ship to ship, but the outlines recur across many captains' articles that do survive. A captain was elected by the crew and could be removed by vote if he proved cowardly or cruel. The quartermaster, also elected, held real power over discipline and the division of plunder and served as a check on the captain's authority, often settling disputes between crewmen that would otherwise have ended in a knife fight. Plunder was divided by fixed shares, with the captain and officers taking a larger cut, but rarely an overwhelming one, commonly 1.5 or 2 shares against a common sailor's single share, and a man who lost an eye, a hand, or a leg in a fight was often entitled to a fixed compensation from the common fund before the rest was split, an early and informal version of the disability provisions. No merchant or naval service of the period offered its own wounded. None of this made pirate ships democracies in any modern sense, and captains who broke the trust of their crews could be marooned or killed. But it was a genuinely more equal arrangement than existed aboard almost any merchant or naval vessel of the period, where a captain's word was close to absolute, backed by the lash, and a sailor had no recourse against abuse at all beyond desertion at the next port. A specific windfall accelerated the island's growth into a pirate haven. In the summer of 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet carrying silver from the American mines was wrecked in a hurricane off the Florida coast, scattering coin and bullion across shallow water for miles along the shore. Spain organized salvage operations, building a fortified camp to guard the recovery effort, but word of the wreck and the fortune still lying in shallow water drew opportunistic wreckers, smugglers, and outright raiders from across the Caribbean, many of whom attacked the official Spanish salvage camps directly, rather than searching the surf themselves. Men who had never planned to turn pirate found themselves suddenly rich, or at least suddenly aware of how easy taking a ship or a guarded camp by force could be, and a wave of new recruits flowed toward Nassau in the following 2 years, exactly the window in which Thatch appears in Hornigold's crew. Captains based at Nassau in this period read like a roll call of the era's most notorious names, Hornigold himself, Charles Vane, known for a temper that eventually cost him his own crew's loyalty, Samuel Bellamy, who would go on to command one of the largest pirate hauls on record before losing his ship and his life in a storm off Cape Cod. And soon enough, Thatch, no longer simply a trusted lieutenant, but building toward a command of his own. The black flag flown by pirate vessels of this period, later generalized into a single skull and crossbones image, in fact varied considerably from ship to ship, some showing a full skeleton, some an hourglass, some a bleeding heart. Its function was consistent even where its design was not, a signal meant to frighten a merchant crew into surrender without a fight, since dead sailors and a damaged prize were worse for business than a quick capitulation, and a captain known to keep his word about sparing a crew that surrendered quickly built a reputation that made his next capture easier still. By the second half of 1717, this loose republic of captains was still thriving, still unpunished by any colonial power strong enough to dislodge it, and it was from this world, not from any single dramatic act of daring, that Thatch's independent career began, with the capture of a French slave ship that would give him both his flagship and his legend. On November 28, 1717, a combined pirate force under Hornigold and Thatch spotted a large French ship near the island of Martinique and gave chase. The vessel, called La Concorde de Nantes, was a slaving ship built for speed and capacity rather than combat, and it carried a crew weakened by scurvy along with a cargo of somewhere near 455 enslaved Africans taken from the West African coast and bound, before the pirates intervened, for sale in the French Caribbean. After a short exchange of cannon fire that inflicted little real damage, the French captain surrendered rather than risk a fight his exhausted crew could not win, a decision that likely saved lives aboard a vessel already weakened by weeks at sea. What happened next reveals a part of this story often left out of the swashbuckling version. The pirates took the ship as a prize, along with its cargo, and the historical record, while incomplete, indicates the captives aboard were treated as property to be divided rather than people to be freed. Some accounts describe a portion put ashore or transferred to a smaller vessel given to the French crew in exchange, while others, and some of the same accounts, describe a significant number kept aboard and forced to continue working the ship under its new pirate masters, a grim continuity between the trade the ship had been built for and the trade that had just seized it. The exact numbers and outcomes are disputed among historians, but the broad shape that Blackbeard's flagship began its pirate career on the deck of a slave ship and did not free everyone it found aboard is not, and it is a detail the more romantic tellings of his story tend to leave out entirely. La Concorde itself was renamed Queen Anne's Revenge after the recently deceased British monarch and refitted at a Caribbean anchorage over the following weeks. Extra gun ports were cut into her hull, and she emerged carrying something close to 40 cannon, an armament that put her on par with a small warship and made her, by a wide margin, the most powerful vessel any pirate captain commanded in American waters at the time. A merchant vessel that might have risked a fight against a lone sloop of 6 or 8 guns had no realistic chance against a ship carrying 5 times that number, and most simply struck their colours the moment her gun ports opened. With a ship of that size under him, Thatch's position within the loose pirate confederation shifted decisively. He was no longer a promising subordinate, but a commander whose flagship alone could deter most merchant crews from resisting at all, and captains who had sailed as his equals a year earlier now increasingly sailed under his flag instead. Hornigold's role in the pirate world ended not long after. By the start of 1718, he had grown wary of the increasing pressure from British authorities and the arrival of a new, more determined governor being sent to the Bahamas, and he accepted a royal pardon, later even serving the crown as a pirate hunter himself, turning on men he had once sailed beside and using his own detailed knowledge of the Bahamian shoals to track them down. His departure left Thatch, as the senior figure among the captains still operating in the region, commanding Queen Anne's Revenge along with a growing squadron of smaller sloops that fed off her reputation as much as her guns. Into this squadron came Stede Bonnet, an unlikely addition to any pirate crew. Bonnet was a wealthy landowner from Barbados, a former army officer with no real seafaring experience, who had reportedly purchased his own sloop, the Revenge, and turned to piracy on what some contemporaries described as a personal whim, possibly to escape an unhappy marriage or the boredom of plantation life, though the sources for his motives are gossip more than fact, and his own crew found his lack of nautical knowledge a constant liability in a trade where a wrong order in a storm could sink a ship. He proved so ineffective as a captain, unable to command the respect or discipline of his own crew, that when his path crossed Thatch's in the late summer of 1717, Thatch effectively took over practical command of Bonnet's ship while allowing Bonnet to keep the title of captain and live aboard as something closer to a passenger, an arrangement that spared Bonnet the embarrassment of an open mutiny, while giving Thatch a second hull without the trouble of crewing it from scratch. It was an arrangement that suited both men for a time. Bonnet kept his pride and his ship, and Thatch gained another hull and crew under his effective control, a squadron now numbering 4 vessels heading into 1718, the year that would carry him first to Charleston and then to the coast of North Carolina, where his career would take its strangest turn. What made Edward Thatch effective was not, by most surviving accounts, an unusual appetite for violence. What made him effective was theatre. He grew his beard long and black, past his waist by some descriptions, and braided it into small plaits tied off with coloured ribbon. A look no other captain of the period is recorded adopting, and one that made him instantly recognisable to any sailor who had heard the stories even before his ship came fully into view. Before boarding a captured ship, he reportedly tucked several lengths of slow-burning cannon match. The same cord gunners used to touch off a cannon's charge under the brim of his hat, lighting them so that smoke curled up around his face the entire time he stood on a stranger's deck. Contemporary accounts describe the effect as something closer to an apparition than a man, and that was precisely the point. A merchant crew that believed its attacker to be something monstrous surrendered faster, with less resistance, and fewer casualties on either side, which meant less damage to the cargo everyone involved actually wanted intact, and less risk to his own crew, whose loyalty depended on staying alive and getting paid, rather than dying gloriously over someone else's tea chest. The historical record, thin as it is on many details of his life, is fairly consistent on this. There is no well-documented instance of Thatch killing a prisoner in cold blood, and most of his captures went exactly as this strategy intended, with crews striking their colours the moment his flagship's guns were run out, and his reputation preceded him close enough to see. This does not make him a gentle figure. He commanded through fear deliberately cultivated, threatened violence freely, and by at least one account once fired a pistol under a table at his own crew during a drinking bout, wounding one of his own men in the knee, seemingly to remind them who commanded the ship, a small, calculated act of cruelty aimed inward rather than outward, meant to keep his own crew as afraid of him as any merchant captain was. But the popular image of a captain who slaughtered indiscriminately does not match the pattern the surviving records actually show. His violence was mostly a performance calibrated to avoid the expense and risk of an actual fight, since a damaged ship, a wounded crew, or a burned cargo cost him money whichever side of the fighting he was on. The business itself, stripped of the theatre, worked the same way it always had for successful pirate captains. Intelligence gathered in taverns, and from captured sailors about which ships were sailing when and carrying what, a fast approach that closed the distance before a target could run for a friendly harbour, and an overwhelming show of force that made resistance look like a poor bet before a single shot was fired. Through the winter and spring of 1718, that reputation, combined with Queen Anne's Revenge's very real firepower, let his growing squadron take ship after ship along the shipping lanes between the Bahamas and the Carolinas, with minimal resistance, plundering cargoes of rum, sugar, cloth and coin without needing to fight for most of it. Colonial newspapers, still a young institution in British America, began to carry his name with growing frequency, spelled inconsistently Thatch, Teach, Tack, but attached increasingly often to the nickname that would outlive every alternative, Blackbeard. Merchants who lost cargo to him complained loudly to their governors. Governors who had no navy of their own to send after him could do little more than write increasingly urgent letters to London, letters that, given the months an Atlantic crossing took each way, arrived long after the squadron they described had moved on to another stretch of coast entirely. By May of 1718, that squadron numbered 4 vessels and something close to 300 or 400 men, and its commander decided the time had come for a target grander than any single merchant ship. Not a prize to be captured, but a city's entire trade to be held hostage at once. That siege already told at the start of this story, the 6 ships across Charleston's harbour bar, the frightened hostages, the demand for a single chest of medicine rather than a fortune in gold, was the high point of his reputation, the moment his name meant more than his cannon did. It was also, though nobody involved could have known it yet, the beginning of the end. A squadron that size, flush with plunder and drawing that much attention from every colonial government on the coast, had become too large, too visible, and too dangerous to its own commander to hold together much longer, and a leader who understood the value of appearance, as well as Thatch did, could hardly have missed how quickly that appearance was turning into a liability. Within weeks of sailing away from Charleston harbour, Thatch's squadron turned north along the coast toward Topsail Inlet, a shallow passage on what is today called Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, a stretch of water known for sandbars that shifted with every storm and current, treacherous to any captain unfamiliar with its channels, and utterly unlike the deep, well-charted approach to Charleston his squadron had just left. In early June of 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge ran hard aground there. A sloop that came to its aid, attempting to pull the larger ship free, ran aground itself in the same shallow water shortly after, and both vessels were effectively lost, their hulls settling into the sand as the tide worked against every attempt to float them free. Most historians who have studied the episode believe the grounding was not simple bad seamanship but a deliberate act, engineered by Thatch himself to solve a problem his success at Charleston had created. A squadron of 300 or more men and 4 ships was difficult to control, expensive to provision, since that many mouths ate through captured stores far faster than new prizes could replace them, and impossible to hide from the growing number of colonial officials now watching every stretch of coast for his sails. It also meant splitting plunder among a very large number of shares, diluting what any one man, especially the captain, actually walked away with. Wrecking 2 of the 4 vessels gave him a plausible excuse to strand a large portion of his own crew, men whose loyalty he could not fully trust, and whose cut of the treasure he apparently preferred to keep for a much smaller, more reliable circle who would ask fewer questions about where the Charleston plunder had actually gone. Roughly 20 to 25 men, by the surviving accounts, were marooned on a small sandy island near the wreck site, with little food, less fresh water, and no ship of their own, effectively, abandoned by the commander they had followed through the Charleston blockade only weeks earlier, left to signal passing vessels or wait for rescue with nothing but what they could salvage from the wrecks before the tide covered them completely. Stede Bonnet, who had briefly left the squadron to seek his own pardon, and returned to find his sloop and much of his crew scattered, eventually rescued most of the marooned men, an act that did nothing to repair his own increasingly damaged reputation as a competent captain, but did at least save their lives, and it is one of the few moments in Bonnet's short career that later historians describe with anything like sympathy. Thatch, meanwhile, transferred himself, a small hand-picked crew, and a disproportionate share of the accumulated plunder from Charleston and the preceding months of raiding onto a much smaller sloop, which he renamed Adventure. What had been a 4-ship squadron numbering in the hundreds was reduced within days to a single vessel with a crew historians estimate at somewhere between 30 and 40 men, a fraction of its former size but concentrated with a far greater share of wealth per man aboard, a deliberate trade of scale for control that let him move faster, hide more easily, and answer to fewer men than the Charleston operation ever had. The wreck of Queen Anne's Revenge itself sat in the shallows of Beaufort Inlet for nearly 3 centuries afterward. A wreck believed by most researchers to be hers was located there in 1996, and cannon, ballast stones, and other artifacts recovered from the site, including cannonballs still packed in their original wadding, are now displayed in a North Carolina museum, the most tangible physical trace that survives of this entire chapter of his career. With his operation drastically smaller, and for the moment much less visible, Thatch sailed his reduced crew toward a small settlement on the North Carolina coast called Bath, seeking not another prize, but something closer to a way out of the life that had made him famous. Bath, North Carolina, in 1718 was a modest port, one of the colony's first chartered towns, home to perhaps a few hundred residents, a handful of merchants, and a governor with far less authority and far fewer resources than the men running Virginia or South Carolina to either side of him. It was here, in June of 1718, that Thatch and his reduced crew arrived, and it was here that he applied for and received a royal pardon under an act of grace King George I had issued the previous year, offering clemency to any pirate who surrendered and swore off the trade before a set date. Many pirates across the Caribbean and American coast took advantage of the same offer around this time, including Hornigold, Thatch Old Captain, and the pardon itself was a genuine, if imperfectly enforced, attempt by the Crown to drain the pirate havens by making legitimate retirement more attractive than the constant risk of capture, since a hanged pirate cost the Crown a trial and gained it nothing, while a pardoned one at least stopped preying on shipping. Governor Charles Eden granted the pardon personally, and by most accounts the two men developed something closer to a working relationship than a simple administrative transaction. Thatch seems to have settled into Bath's small society for a period that summer, reportedly acquiring a house on a creek near the town, mixing with local officials and merchants over dinners and drink, and, according to several contemporary sources of uneven reliability, marrying a young local woman, sometimes named as Mary Ormond, in a ceremony Eden himself may have attended. Whether this marriage was his first, as most sober historians now assume, or one of a string of previous wives claimed by a hostile pamphlet published shortly after his death, which put the number as high as 14, is impossible to verify from the surviving record. The higher figure in particular is now generally treated by historians as sensational exaggeration, meant to blacken a dead man's reputation rather than a documented fact, part of the same pamphlet tradition that also supplied the beard matches detail and the buried treasure legend, with no real evidence behind any of them. For a brief period, the pardoned pirate appears to have lived something close to an ordinary life in a small colonial port, a former terror of the shipping lanes, now a local curiosity, entertained by the same officials whose ships he might once have taken, and by some accounts welcomed at the tables of men who found his stories, and perhaps his continued usefulness, more valuable than any grudge over lost cargo. It is tempting, and was tempting even to some of his contemporaries, to read this as genuine reform. A dangerous man who had made his fortune and chosen to walk away from the trade while he still could, settling into the kind of respectable colonial life that piracy itself had made possible for him. But the pardon, as written, covered only acts of piracy committed before the cut-off date it named. It offered no protection for anything committed afterward, and the surviving record over the following months suggests Thatch did not fully leave the life behind, even if he had for a while stopped raiding the open shipping lanes directly. Instead, over the summer, and into the fall of 1718, he appears to have found a quieter, more discreet way to keep profiting from the same skills, one that depended less on cannon fire and more on the cooperation of the very governor who had just pardoned him, a partnership that would prove far more damaging to Eden's reputation than anything Thatch had done while still openly a pirate. In late September or early October of 1718, Thatch's sloop returned to the North Carolina coast with a French vessel in tow, loaded with a valuable cargo of sugar and cocoa, goods that would fetch a strong price in any colonial port, willing to overlook exactly how they had been acquired. His explanation, when questioned, was that he had found the ship drifting at sea, apparently abandoned by its crew, and had simply taken possession of an ownerless prize, a claim that under maritime law would have entitled him and his men to the cargo as legitimate salvage rather than plunder taken by force which his pardon did not cover. The claim was, to put it gently, convenient. No French crew was ever produced to confirm the ship had truly been abandoned. No log or ship's papers were presented that showed a genuine wreck or mutiny aboard her, and few observers at the time or since have found the story especially credible for a vessel that arrived intact enough to be sailed straight into a North Carolina inlet, with a full cargo still aboard. What makes the episode more than a minor footnote is what happened next. Governor Eden's own Vice-Admiralty Court, the body responsible for ruling on exactly this kind of maritime claim, heard the case with what most historians describe as remarkably little scrutiny, took no meaningful testimony from anyone outside Thatch's own crew, and ruled in Thatch's favour within days, granting him and his crew clear title to the cargo. Tobias Knight, the colony's customs collector and a close associate of Eden, was directly involved in processing the claim, and later investigations suggested that a share of the French cargo, sugar in particular, ended up stored at Knight's own property rather than being properly accounted for as government revenue, with the strong implication that Eden himself also benefited quietly from the arrangement, perhaps through a discreet share never entered in any ledger. Whatever the precise mechanics of the deal, the pattern was clear to observers in neighbouring colonies well before any formal investigation confirmed it. Bath had become a safe harbour, where a pardoned pirate could continue operating a version of his old trade with the tacit protection, and possibly the direct financial participation, of the colony's own governor using the language of maritime salvage law to launder what any honest court would have called plunder. Merchants trading along the Carolina and Virginia coast, who had no reason to trust that Thatch's reform was genuine, grew increasingly vocal in their complaints, some going so far as to petition their own colonial assemblies for protection, and word of the arrangement travelled north to a colony with both the motive and, unlike North Carolina, the naval resources to act on it. That colony was Virginia, and its governor, watching a pardoned pirate operate with apparent impunity just across a poorly defined border, was already weighing a response that would ignore the inconvenient fact that North Carolina was, technically, none of his business. Alexander Spotswood, the royal governor of Virginia, had spent much of 1718 hearing complaints from merchants whose ships and profits were threatened by a pirate operating with what looked increasingly like official protection from the neighbouring colony's own governor. Spotswood had no legal authority whatsoever inside North Carolina. Colonial governors' powers stopped firmly at their own borders, and any operation he mounted across that line, even against a wanted pirate, risked serious diplomatic and legal consequences with the crown that had appointed both men, since acting inside another governor's jurisdiction without leave could easily be read in London as one royal appointee undermining another. He decided to act anyway, judging the threat to Virginia's own trade, and his own political standing as a governor who had failed to protect it, worth the risk. Spotswood arranged with Captain George Gordon, commander of the Royal Navy warship Pearl stationed in Virginia waters, and with the smaller warship Lyme also on station, to outfit 2 shallow-draft sloops named Jane and Ranger, capable of navigating the narrow sand-choked inlets of the Carolina coast that a deep-hulled warship could never enter. Full-sized naval vessels were useless in the shallow sounds where Thatch was now operating. The whole plan depended on finding vessels light enough to follow him into water he had chosen precisely because he believed nothing else could reach him there, and Spotswood's staff spent weeks quietly locating and provisioning craft of the right draft, rather than simply sending his largest available ships south. Command of the expedition went to Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Pearl, an experienced naval officer given, for this mission, an unusually free hand and a strong personal incentive. Spotswood offered a substantial reward, funded partly from his own pocket and partly by an act of the Virginia Assembly, for Thatch's capture or death, with graduated payments for his officers and crew as well, a bounty structure meant to make every man aboard both sloops fight as though the reward were his alone to win. Secrecy mattered as much as speed, an operation mounted openly across a colonial border, against a pardoned man currently in apparent good standing with his own governor, invited exactly the kind of legal challenge Spotswood most wanted to avoid, so the sloops were fitted out quietly and manned with volunteer sailors and marines drawn from the 2 warships, roughly 60 men between them, with orders kept close enough that even some of the men aboard reportedly did not know their exact destination until the sloops were already under sail. The 2 sloops departed Virginia waters in mid-November of 1718, sailing south along the coast toward the sounds and inlets of North Carolina, carrying men who had never fought this particular enemy but who knew, from Spotswood's briefing and from the reward waiting at the end of it, exactly what they were being sent to do. Somewhere ahead of them, in a shallow anchorage called Ocracoke, a much smaller crew than Thatch had commanded at Charleston, was settling in for what none of them yet knew would be their last few days of freedom. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are a thin ribbon of sand strung between the open Atlantic and a chain of shallow inland sounds, cut here and there by inlets where the 2 bodies of water meet and mix. These inlets are not fixed features. Storms and currents move their sandbars year to year, sometimes closing an old channel entirely and opening a new one nearby, and only pilots with intimate, constantly updated local knowledge could navigate them with any confidence. Knowledge that took years on that specific stretch of coast to acquire, and that no chart of the period could fully capture before the next storm made it obsolete. Ocracoke Inlet, one of the more stable and best known of these passages, offered a natural anchorage sheltered from the open ocean, exactly the kind of refuge a captain wanting to avoid deep-draft naval pursuit would seek out, close enough to the mainland sounds to trade quietly with local merchants, and far enough from any colonial capital to escape regular patrol. Thatch's sloop Adventure lay anchored there in the days before November 21, 1718, with a crew, reduced from the hundreds who had followed him to Charleston, down to somewhere between 18 and 25 men, the smaller, more trusted circle he had kept after the Beaufort Inlet grounding months earlier. Some later accounts describe him entertaining other pirates or local traders aboard in the days before the battle, drinking heavily through at least one of those nights, though these details rest on sources written after his death and should be treated with some caution rather than accepted as certain fact. A man confident enough in the protection of a friendly governor and the difficulty of the surrounding water might well have let his guard down exactly this way. On the evening of November 21, Maynard's 2 sloops, Jane and Ranger, arrived at the mouth of the inlet, unfamiliar with its shifting channel and unwilling to risk running aground in darkness before the fight had even begun. Maynard anchored his vessels at the inlet-us edge, rather than pressing in immediately, choosing to wait for daylight and the chance to actually see the sandbars his charts could only estimate. Some accounts describe an exchange of shots or shouted defiance between the 2 anchored forces that evening, and one popular but not fully reliable telling has Thatch and his crew spending part of the night drinking and firing pistols in a show of bravado rather than preparing seriously for a fight they may not have expected to actually happen. How much of this reflects fact, and how much reflects the same pamphlet tradition that later inflated his wife count, is difficult to say with confidence. What is certain is that neither side moved further that night. 2 small groups of armed men sat within sight of each other across a stretch of dark, shallow water, each aware of what daylight would bring in the same treacherous sandbars and channels that had sheltered pirates on this coast for years, and were, within a matter of hours, about to decide the outcome of the fight itself. The same geography that had made Thatch's whole operation possible, now sitting between him and the open water he would need to escape a fight he had not chosen to have that night. At first light on November 22, 1718, Maynard's 2 sloops moved to close the distance across the inlet, and the shallow, unfamiliar water immediately began working against them exactly as it had against so many larger ships before. Both Jane and Ranger ran aground on sandbars while still well short of adventure, forcing their crews to scramble to lighten the vessels, throwing over ballast, water casks, and anything else they could spare to float free again, all while under the eyes of a crew that had chosen this anchorage precisely because it knew the ground and could watch the attack stall before it had properly begun. As the sloops finally worked themselves loose and closed the last stretch of water, Thatch crew answered with a devastating close-range broadside, loaded, by most accounts, with scrap metal and cut shot rather than standard cannonballs, a charge meant to shred rigging sails, and exposed men rather than punch holes in a hull that would sink long before anyone could tow it home for a reward. It worked with brutal effectiveness. Several of Maynard's men were killed or badly wounded in that single volley, among them the captain of Ranger, and the Jane in particular took heavy losses on her open deck. Her crew cut down in the same instant. They thought the fight was finally about to begin in earnest. Rather than retreat, Maynard adapted. He ordered most of his surviving unwounded men below decks out of sight, leaving only himself and a small visible party on the exposed deck, hoping to convince Thatch crew that the sloop was more crippled than it truly was, and draw them into boarding rather than firing another devastating broadside. From a safe distance, where their advantage in gunnery would simply grind Jane down. The tactic worked. Believing the fight nearly won, Thatch and a group of his men leaped aboard Jane to finish the job at close quarters, and Maynard's hidden crew rose from below to meet them, turning the deck into a confused, close-packed melee of pistol shots and sword blows in the space of a few square yards, exactly the kind of fight Maynard had gambled his remaining men could win once the numbers were no longer stacked against him by the sloop's guns. Maynard and Thatch found each other directly in the fighting, and the 2 exchanged pistol fire before closing with swords. Maynard's blade reportedly snapped in the exchange, leaving him briefly defenseless against a much larger opponent, and he was saved, by most tellings, by one of his own crewmen slashing Thatch across the throat or neck from behind at the critical moment, an intervention that likely spared Maynard's own life in the seconds it bought him to step back and draw a second pistol. Even wounded, Thatch continued fighting. The most frequently cited account of the battle, drawn from Charles Johnson's Early History of Pirates published only a few years later, describes him absorbing some 5 pistol shots and more than 20 sword wounds before he finally collapsed and died on the deck, a level of damage that later historians generally treat as likely exaggerated for dramatic effect even while, accepting that the fight itself was genuinely brutal and prolonged for a shipboard engagement of this kind, fought hand-to-hand in a space no larger than a modest room. With their captain dead and their own numbers badly reduced, the surviving pirates aboard Adventure quickly surrendered rather than continue a fight already lost, throwing down their weapons the moment it became clear the man whose reputation had won so many bloodless surrenders before was no longer alive to intimidate anyone. Maynard ordered Thatch's head severed from his body and hung from the bowsprit of one of his sloops, a grim but practical decision. It served both as proof needed to claim Spotswood's reward, since a body alone could be disputed or lost on the voyage home, and as a deliberate warning, displayed as the victorious sloops made their way back up the Sound, to any other pirate crew that might see it pass, and think twice about what refuge these waters still offered. The surviving members of Thatch's crew, roughly 13 to 15 men, were carried north to Williamsburg, Virginia, to face trial under Admiralty law, a special legal process reserved for maritime crimes precisely because ordinary colonial courts had no clear jurisdiction over acts committed at sea or across ambiguous borders, like the one this whole affair had already crossed twice, first when Spotswood sent his sloops into North Carolina waters, and again when the survivors were carried out of them for trial elsewhere. The trials in the spring of 1719 moved quickly by the standards of the day. Most of the accused were convicted and hanged along the waterfront in a public execution meant to serve the same deterrent purpose as the severed head that had already made the journey up the coast, drawing crowds who had heard the name Blackbeard in every tavern and newspaper for the better part of 2 years. A handful were pardoned or acquitted, generally those able to convince the court they had been pressed into service against their will rather than joining the crew freely. A defence pirate crews genuinely did sometimes use to shield forced recruits, often skilled tradesmen like carpenters or surgeons taken from captured ships and kept aboard against their wishes, from the same fate as willing volunteers. The scandal did not end with the crew. Investigators soon turned their attention to Tobias Knight, the North Carolina customs collector implicated in approving Thatch's dubious French prize claim months earlier, and a search of his own property reportedly turned up goods that appeared to have come from that captured cargo, evidence strongly suggesting he had personally profited from protecting a man he knew to still be operating outside the bounds of his pardon. Knight stood trial on related charges but was acquitted, or in some accounts died before the matter was fully resolved, and the surviving record leaves his ultimate fate somewhat unclear, even as the core suspicion against him remained widely believed at the time. Governor Eden himself, despite the strong circumstantial case that he too had benefited from the arrangement, faced public criticism and a formal complaint, but was never removed from office, retaining his position until his death from natural causes a few years later, a reminder that a colonial governor's political protection could survive even a well-founded scandal that hanged a dozen lesser men, and that the same law used to hang common sailors rarely reached the officials who had quietly enabled them. What outlasted every trial and every acquittal was the story itself. Within a few years of his death, a popular pamphlet history, compiled under the name Charles Johnson, spread Thatch's legend far beyond the coast where he had actually operated, and it is largely that account, not the surviving court records, that fixed the beard, the smoking matches, and the reputation for savage cruelty in the public imagination for the next 3 centuries. The same tradition invented, or at least dramatically inflated other details that still circulate as fact. The claim of 14 wives, the suggestion that he buried treasure somewhere along the coast that has never been found despite generations of searching with everything from shovels to modern metal detectors. No credible evidence has ever surfaced for a hidden Blackbeard fortune anywhere, a detail the legend has simply never allowed to interfere with the story, since a pirate who spent his money on wine, gunpowder, and a wedding rather than burying it in a chest makes for a far less romantic ending than the one generations of treasure hunters have preferred to believe. Thatch's death at Ocracoke did not happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of a coordinated push against piracy that had already begun months earlier and continued for several years afterward. In July of 1718, Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself and now the first royal governor formally appointed to restore British authority over the Bahamas, arrived at Nassau with a small naval squadron and a fresh proclamation of the king's pardon in hand. Faced with an armed governor backed by warships rather than the absent authority they had exploited for years, many of the pirate captains still based there chose to accept the pardon and give up the trade, at least on paper. Hornigold, Thatch Old Commander, was among those who not only accepted, but went on to actively hunt down former colleagues on the Crown's behalf, using the same knowledge of the island's hidden anchorages that had once made him one of the most successful pirates operating out of them. Not every captain complied. Charles Vane, one of the more defiant figures still operating out of Nassau, refused Rogers' pardon outright and burned a captured ship in the harbour as a final act of contempt before sailing away rather than surrender, a gesture meant to remind Rogers and everyone watching that the Old Republic had not simply rolled over the moment a governor's ship appeared offshore. He continued raiding for roughly 2 more years before being shipwrecked, captured, and ultimately hanged at Port Royal, Jamaica, in 1721, one more name added to the growing list of captains the crackdown eventually caught up with, regardless of how long they managed to stay ahead of it. Another chapter closed in Jamaica in November of 1720, when the pirate Captain John Rackham, commonly known as Calico Jack, was captured along with his crew after a naval sloop surprised his ship at anchor. Among that crew were 2 women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who had sailed and fought alongside the men rather than remaining ashore. A detailed contemporary accounts found scandalous enough to record in unusual detail even by the standards of pirate trial reporting, though exactly how openly their identities were known aboard ship before their capture is debated among historians who have studied the surviving trial records. Rackham and most of the male crew were hanged. Both women, having claimed pregnancy, were spared execution, at least for the time being, under a legal provision that stayed the sentence of pregnant women, and their eventual fates afterward remain only partially documented. Taken together, the Nassau Pardon Campaign, Vanné's eventual execution, the Rackham trial, and the killing of Thatch himself only weeks apart from the first of these events formed a single widening net across 1718 to 1721. Closing in on a pirate world that had, only a few years earlier, operated almost entirely without fear of serious consequence. The most damaging blow of all, though, was still a little further off, waiting for the era's last, and by most measures, most successful captain. The pirate whose career historians most often credit with actually closing the Golden Age of Piracy was not Blackbeard at all, but a Welsh captain named Bartholomew Roberts, who took up the trade only after Thatch was already dead, and went on to capture several hundred vessels across the Caribbean and the West African coast, a scale of plunder that dwarfed anything Thatch himself ever managed in his far shorter and more localized career along the American seaboard. Roberts was finally killed in action off Cape Lopez, on the coast of West Africa, in February of 1722, cut down by grapeshot during an engagement with a Royal Navy warship sent specifically to hunt him down after years of complaints from merchants trading along that same coast. His death, roughly 3.5 years after the fight at Ocracoke, is the moment many historians point to as the true closing chapter of large-scale, organised piracy in the Atlantic world, the last captain still capable of assembling a fleet large enough to threaten a colonial economy rather than a single ship at a time. Beyond any single captain's death, the deeper forces that had produced the Golden Age were also reversing by the early 1720s. The Royal Navy, which had shrunk drastically after 1713, was gradually rebuilt and its American patrols expanded specifically in response to years of pirate depredation, closing off exactly the kind of undefended shipping lanes that had made the trade so profitable and so low risk a decade earlier, with more warships stationed permanently in colonial waters rather than recalled to Britain the moment a European war ended. Colonial governments coordinated more closely with each other and with London, sharing intelligence and, when needed, ignoring jurisdictional lines the way Spotswood had at Ocracoke rather than let a pirate haven fester across an inconvenient border, a lesson the Eden scandal had made impossible for other governors to ignore. And the broader Atlantic economy, no longer disrupted by 2 decades of European war, slowly reabsorbed the pool of trained, desperate sailors who had once had nowhere else to turn. New merchant and naval berths opened as trade recovered and colonial populations grew, quietly draining the recruitment pool piracy had depended on since 1713, far more effectively than any single hanging or bounty ever could. By the mid-1720s, organised piracy on anything like the earlier scale had been reduced to scattered, hunted remnants, chased from one hiding place to the next until there were none left worth the risk, the last captains dying in ones and twos rather than commanding fleets of hundreds. Ocracoke, then, was not the single hinge on which the whole era turned. Roberts alone accounted for more captured shipping in his few years than Thatch ever did in his, but it was the moment the pattern became visible for the first time. A colonial governor, willing to cross a border he had no legal right to cross, 2 shallow sloops built specifically to follow a pirate into the sandbars he had always trusted to protect him, and a fight won not by a bigger ship or more guns, but by knowing in the same treacherous water the pirates themselves had always relied on. The refuge stopped being a refuge the moment the hunters learned to use it too, and every governor who watched Spotswood succeed where caution would have failed learned the same lesson. A border was worth less than a coastline kept safe for trade. The slow match that once curled smoke past a braided Blackbeard needed a living man to light it. After November of 1718, the legend needed nothing but a printing press to keep burning, spreading further and longer than the man himself ever sailed, still recognisable on shop signs and film posters and cereal boxes, 3 centuries after the sandbar gave way beneath 2 grounded sloops and let the hunters finally close the distance. Ocracoke Inlet still shifts. The channel Robert Maynard sloops ran aground in has moved so many times since 1718 that nobody can point to the exact stretch of water and say, "Here, this is where it happened." Divers have found an old wreck nearby that many believe is the grounded Queen Anne's Revenge from 2 years before, its cannon and ballast stones pulled up piece by piece and laid out under glass in a museum a short drive from the inlet, but the sandbar that decided the battle itself has long since moved somewhere else, or vanished or become open water. The coast keeps no monuments, only the sea keeps rearranging the evidence. What the sea cannot erase is the print that outlived the man by centuries. Within a year of his death, a pamphlet account of his life was already circulating through London coffee-houses, thickened with details no witness ever swore to, and it is that account, not the muster rolls or the Admiralty records, that gave the world the beard, the matches, the missing treasure nobody has ever found because it was never buried, and the 14th wife nobody can verify, the men who actually ended the Golden Age, a naval lieutenant with a broken sword, a Welsh captain cut down by grapeshot off a coast 3,000 miles from Ocracoke, a governor rebuilding a fleet nobody had bothered to keep afloat in peacetime, left far thinner traces than the man whose death merely announced that the ending had begun. The real Edward Thatch drowned in the legend almost as quickly as he drowned in the tide-off Ocracoke. What remains, on the shifting sand and in the pamphlets both, is a shape the water keeps almost, but never quite, giving back.